Hi, welcome. My name's Phil Winder, and I'm the CEO of Winder.ai. A few weeks ago, I sat down with Javier Campos, who was at the forefront of the EU AI Act that is about to enter legislation later this year. In this discussion, we talk more about the ethics behind the premise of the Act and also what businesses need to start thinking about now. This is a recorded discussion, so we won't be able to answer any of your questions at this time, but please do stick around. It's a really interesting discussion. Hi, welcome everyone. My name's Phil Winder, and today I'm going to be interviewing Javier Campos, who has had a lot of experience with the EU AI Act and has a lot of insight that I think will be really useful for everybody to hear. Javier, I'd like to pass it over to you. Who are you and what do you do?
Thank you, Phil. Hello, everyone. So my name is Javier Campos. My professional background includes working as a C-level CIO, CTO in various companies. I started as management consultant in Accenture, and then I moved from one of my clients. So I always been at the forefront of the implementation. But in my last two roles, I have the opportunity, and it's been quite interesting to get involved into the legislation, both in the UK and in Europe. So in the EU, I was involved in legislation of the privacy, the first cookie law, which was back in the early 2010s. So I was traveling quite a bit to Brussels. And then recently on the EU and the AI law, which again, I was having some calls with Brussels to provide input on how to define the law and then on the implementation. I have, my current role is a CIO of Fenestra, which is a global programmatic company. We create AI software that optimize programmatic campaigns for our clients. And I have also recently published a book about AI, which I talk about a lot about, of course, legislation, regulation, and how to comply all these different things.
Cool. What's the book called? Let's get
Yes, it's how to grow your business with AI, a
Perfect.
first principle approach. And it's interesting because there are many books about AI. Some are very, very technical, some are very, very high level. So it's very ambitious and try to be in the middle. I said, what do you really need to tackle? So, for example, if a technical person read my books, there are some technical bits, but not massively technical. So it's very practical how to deploy AI. But for a technical person, we allow them to talk to the business and make sure to really consider before going into the implementation what they need to do. And for the business the other one, it will really help them to understand on a first principle how to do AI, and the same principle for the legislation. How is different legislation in different countries and how to think about it. The book provides, and there are a couple of chapters on how to give you tools and frameworks to how to address the legislation and be successful.
Okay, cool. I'll check it out. That sounds good. All right, so I think today what I'd like to dig into a little bit more, and I know that you have a lot of context with previous legislation as well, which actually could be quite useful depending on what we're talking about. But I mean, really the focus or the interest that I have at the moment is on the EU AI Act, because I believe that it is probably one of the most impactful pieces of legislation that has emerged certainly in the AI industry, but maybe even in the technical industry in general. I'd really love to get your thoughts on it. So just sort of a high level setting the context type questions to begin with. What is the AI Act and what does it attempt to do and why is it being done now?
Yes, that's a very, very good question and also very timely. I have to say here, the EU was there are a few countries that they've been a bit ahead of the pack. In particular, I call out Singapore, and I really strong the people in here to take a look at how they address the whole AI. I think they've done a very good job. But pretty much all countries are looking at that. The reason is a few years ago, as AI started to make more and more headlines, people in Brussels, they started thinking this is going to be big, so therefore we need to be a bit proactive. Very quickly, I could hear talking, the corridors. They used to call, we need to do a GDPR of AI. That's the sort of internal chat, meaning quite a comprehensive law to protect consumers' interests. To be fair, and the EU regulation, and I'll talk about my views. What I think, some things are good, some things could be improved, but if you think about in GDPR, it is true that the European Union set the global standard, and actually after what they do, and they did actually, you could argue, quite successfully around the world. And pretty much after that, they set the tone, and then all countries follow. And now, even California, the Privacy Act is very pretty much copying and pasting the GDPR. Brazil, Australia, so all the countries follow. So I think that from the beginning, the Brussels realized AI is going to be big. We want to protect citizens. Let's do the GDPR of AI. The original intentions were quite high, of course, at these things, and the law has been quite a few years on the making. Different versions is been watering down or shaping and it's changed from the first draft. So I think ultimately what the objective, and we will see whether it's successful or not, but the objective of the regulation is to how can all the European citizens can use AI in a safe way, safe for the consumer and safe for the country. That's pretty much the underlying principle, how to protect the rights of the citizens, which again, the EU have the human rights, the basic ones on privacy, dignity, and so on. So it actually drags a lot of the first principle from other legislations and apply them to specifically AI, and then does a number of things to ensure that. But at the fundamental first principle, which is what my book talks about all the time, is focused a lot on protecting the consumer, which, as I said, is the European Union, and that's one thing you have to say in favor, is they're actually one of the countries that they really, really focus a lot on the citizen. Other countries tends to be a bit more on the enterprise side, on the commercial side, which is always a fine balance.
Yeah, interesting. I didn't realize that Singapore had any legislation. I knew that China released like a watered down set of AI legislation in sort of the middle of, I think it was like August 23, something like that. So how does previous legislation compare to what the EU are trying to do here?
No, well, I will say, which is that there is no specific one in Europe, but there were other bits, and I can talk a little bit about how these, for example, in banking, it was my last industry, there are some legislation which they regulate the automation of the algorithms. So this, is another level on top of that. So I think this law, I will say, is the EU is one of the. I will need to check, but I think technically the Singapore. No, actually, I know Singapore was released earlier than the European, because the European has been a couple of years on draft. They over there, the way it's actually a use case how the government works in Singapore is very, very efficient, and they move quickly. They get a bunch of industry. I actually participated in a couple of project to the in my last company. They were looking for the regulator very early on. One of the things he was looking is tools to check fairness on AI models. So I participated in this process, so I know they were a bit ahead of the EU. So I will say that, compared to the main difference, when you look, there are quite a lot of difference, but the main one is on the ultimately focus. The EU talks and keep talking about the citizen. Some other legislations are a bit more balanced in terms of citizen versus the corporation.
Interesting. Okay. So moving on to slightly more technical interpretation of the act then. So I guess the main structure of the act is a risk based one, and I think that does mimic a lot of the other legislation, like you said, in the banking industry and things like that. Do you think that was the best approach they could have taken in terms of structuring the act, or were there other ways in which other directions that they could have gone in?
Well, that's a very good question. And actually, this is the classical question. Whenever you want to regulate something, and there is always two ways. When you look at the first principle, there are really the two ways to do it. You regulate the principles, or you regulate how it is actually implemented. So the what or the how. Depending on the area, I prefer the uses, the usage. I think for me is the most. So in terms of being effective and achieving what you want to do, in my humble opinion, and I've seen quite a lot of regulation in many areas, I do believe the what is better, but it's more complicated and also more difficult to implement. Because imagine it's like saying regulating. Um, let's say I want to regulate, how long do you stay in your room? So the what will say you shouldn't leave your room. And then the how, I will do rules saying if you cross the door, if you cross the window, there. So one actually, believe it or not, and again, I'm giving a very simple example, but one can get very complicated to really, and that's why it's a principle based. So, for example, the regulating the what, for me, achieve the principle behind the regulation is easier to explain, but it becomes, especially in the border case, the implementation is more difficult. The other on the how is very easy to implement, but then the problem is you can sort of bypass it, and actually, bad actors do bypass it because no matter how many stuff you want to define how to do it, you can always find different ways. So the pros and cons. To be fair, it depends. As I said, for example, and also the regulator. If you look at the UK, here in the UK, the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, they tend to do more the what, the principle-based ruling. So, for example, we say to banks, you have to be fair to consumers, um, which is good for consumer, but it becomes very complicated for banks because what do you mean by fair? How do you mean it? And it's all very. I do believe the financial industry in the UK is quite well regulated. Other regulators tend to be more rule based. That's the. So going back to this principle, I think this is, I will say, the European Union Act is a bit of 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 is a bit of a mixture. It's got a lot of principle based, trying to say, for example, it will say you shouldn't discriminate people. That is very difficult to actually do the how. And that's an area which I did a lot of work in my last company. I actually have a patent on fairness, which is really complex because it's subjective, by the way. And also technically how to, when you do a technical test, if it's accuracy, it's a number, and the number is a number. When it's fairness, is not is the number you're gonna get depends on the framework you're testing, and that's the difficulty. The difficulty is there is not an absolute framework for fairness, and you need to decide how you want, and that defining the values. That's when you introduce the complexity. So going back to your question, I do think they've done a fairly good job. It's a good balance between the principles, and they actually introduce some how exactly what to do and some methods, which is, as I said, is unusual. You either have one or the other. The other thing I will say is in a positive way, which we still have talks, and if you look at when people wrote a letter, people concerning about the whole AI and AGI, there was a letter at the end of last year saying we should pause all development. For me, anything that tries to regulate the actual technology itself, I think is wrong. And I can give an example. Is always, however, I will say you should do principle and you should do the usage of. So, for example, in AI, you should regulate something saying you shouldn't use AI to do genetics or to produce, to, for example, do some sort of test with anything biological material or bioengineering. Thus, in my point of view, is an acceptable usage of the usage. I don't think going after regulating the technology is very helpful. You cannot implement it. Other countries will do. There are many pros and cons. But yeah, going back to the question, I will say the regulation is a good balance between set the principles, protecting the citizen, the discrimination, for example, makes mass surveillance, which is a very very complex area, by the way. And this legislation went through various iterations because governments, of course, governments don't want a private company doing mass surveillance, or, for example, doing social scores, which China is been testing. At the same time, and this is why I know, for example, from my conversations, I know that the French government shaped quite a lot of the first early draft for the security force to leave loops so the security force could actually, and to a certain extent, you say, well, you want to keep citizens safe, so you need to have some legislation. Without going to I know it's a difficult subject because some people will argue there is never a justification for a government to do, but the first ever draft, which I don't think it was even published, the first ever draft, it was very, very strict to even limit their governments for any mass surveillance. Some big security agencies in countries like France and other big countries in Europe, they push saying, no, we need to be able, to a certain extent, detect the bodies. I need these powers. So they were actually leaving holes to this mass surveillance.
No, that's fascinating, because I think, going back to what you said previously about the differences between trying to regulate specific applications versus specific implementations, I think that and linking that to what you just said, so there are some specific applications that are explicitly listed in there and excluded. So, like military use, for example, is excluded from the legislation. So presumably that's their influence.
Exactly, and in the first draft that was included.
Right. Okay. But I mean, interestingly, like it's almost the same side of the coin. The use for sort of domestic policing, it is included for many applications. They still have some exceptions in there, but it's much more restrictive than the military use, for example. And then I think the only other sort of comment I had was related to the introduction of what they're calling generic AI models. What was the term they used? I forget what it's called now, but they basically mean like foundation models that are used for a whole range of potential purposes. And I think that's an example where they have actually legislated against a specific piece of technology there. And I mean, what do you think about that? They've kind of added this whole wrapper around doing generic AI solutions.
Well, I think this is if you ask me, it was a patch introduced later on. I will argue I don't think it works very well, because one of the challenges, and I actually spent numerous calls with the team doing the legislation in Brussels, as giving my input as an industry expert, because one of the first things with any law, any contract, whatever, the first thing you need to do is define definitions. And thus, you cannot imagine, and I'm sure the public, or the audience here might or might not be surprised to know, it was extremely painful, and still I don't think it's done that well, but it's defining what AI is, artificial intelligence. And again, you can really, and I do a lot of presentations, so you can roughly talk about it, say, look, is anything that humans do that machines can mimic human behavior? But that definition, as on the broad thing, is okay. But then when you start getting into the details, is really, really difficult. So I think the point is, we really struggle on the defining exactly what is machine learning, what is, for example, one of um, the big debates was distinguishing machine learning from traditional mathematical models or statistical models. For example, a linear regression. Is linear regression machine learning? That question, by the way, and the technical people listening, you could spend hours. Some people say yes, some people say no. To be fair, both have a bit of a point. If personally, I don't think it is, but still. So the first definition that the EU was going, they were trying to be too big and effectively trying to say ML is everything. You will ask why, or the audience will say, why would I care? Well, actually, it's a big implication, because if you say any mathematical algorithms is AI, all of a sudden this law applies to, pretty much any application you have running there today, any from CRM or whatever. There will be some sort of basic algorithms to calculate you how much I should, for example, price optimization, how much you should, when you call your insurance company, as soon as they pull you data, they will calculate your price. That's an algorithm. Is that AI? And the problem is, if depending on the definition, everything falls there, which all of a sudden it's a huge implication, because then you have to go through current system. So there was a lot of the current definition, even the end definition. So the same happened with foundational models. The definition now is quite generic, and it's got loopholes. I don't think, and you saw when ChatGPT was early release, Italy went very quickly. It was before, to be fair, before the EU was in force, or the Italians banned ChatGPT. They sort of got back. So my view is, which is the problem with this type of any type of legislation, because AI is accelerating to such a speed. And if you think about it, the evolution and the history of AI, the winters or whatever, even something like generative AI, actually not that long ago, about 5, 6 years ago, that was just research in a lab, and now is everywhere. We do, at the same token, and I know because I talk to a lot of labs, and there is a lot of algorithms which are very different. Some of them might be worth touching there, which they're going to be in production, this year, next year, in the next few years, which are very different. And you can't really use the tools, if you want to like what I call the sort of version one of ML algorithms, like the, SGBoost and things like that, some of those type of algorithms, they are good, but they're also quite limited in what they do. They sort of, well, they supervise and superfine, they learn from the data, and then they are limited on what they do or how much they can generalize out of sample, out of what they've been trained. And some of the new technology that comes, this is all going to be very different, because they use something called word models. They are very different. Even generative AI starts blurring the lines. What do you consider copyright, not? What is the actual content? What is not? There is quite a lot of stuck on there. So for me, answering the question, I'm not sure that the way it's been done is quite comprehensive. It's quite a few loopholes, and the other thing is, because it was quite a last addition, this is going to change quite a lot over the last few years. So it's very dangerous to just apply, because again, on the definition of foundational model, I could change. I could actually, once you put a definition, I could tweak my model not to comply. So my take will be, that's very very open ended.
Yeah, I agree. And it almost looks a little bit hasty, that they sort of arbitrarily included the generic AI systems, that kind of wording in there, because it captures a huge segment of the market, which the downstream applications of that may be nothing to do with anything to do. There may be zero risk of any sort of harm. So yeah, they did seem to leave a clause in the act that basically allowed them to update that list when they see fit. So I do think that it will still continue to change moving into the future. Okay, so let's so we've been chatting for a while now, and we've had some really interesting discussions about the sort of the underlying sort of philosophies that sort of fed into this act. But I think now let's talk a little bit more about the implementation or the how a company would actually implement and think about how it affects their business. Let me rephrase that. Sorry. So we've been talking a bit about the underlying philosophies of the legislation, but let's spend a little bit of time talking about the impacts that it will have on industry and on businesses. So I think my first sort of general question is, do you think that this legislation will change how businesses do business in the future?
Absolutely. I think for me, by the way, this I do think this will drive or could drive some of the AI innovation out of Europe because the way it's been written. So I think, and let's take that question in two angles. On the innovation, which I'm very passionate. I've done a lot of innovation in my career and I still do it. I think their regulations sometimes are not, they might be counterproductive, and I will explain why. But then, so leaving the innovation for the last, let's first ask a question for the day to day. You are in a company. How does impact to your company? Well, if your company operates in Europe, whether the European Union, at the moment, by the way, after Brexit, the UK is not, within that market. It remains to be seen how the UK adopt that legislation or not. It's a bit like the GDPR, and there will be a combination. I do think this is, by the way, a potential opportunity for the UK or not. But that's another debate. But for the Europe, your company, you have operations in Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and so on. So the first thing to know is there are, as you mentioned, a list of use cases. So you need to check what your company does. Is that, is your whatever model you're using falls under one of these buckets? And for example, if you use, there are 4 or 5, I can't remember. There is one which is forbidden. So if, hopefully not many people are there, but if you are in there, you can just use AI in Europe. Very, very simple. If you in another area, which so effectively, what the way to do it is saying, what do your company does, or how many models it has. I will be there cautious, by the way, because I said the law is quite open-ended in terms of the definition. So what you might think is no AI, they might think is AI. So I will double check just to be sure. So the way to do it is just check on what use case are you doing, then check the list. What that your potential use case falls. If it's forbid, is very simple. If it's just very low risk, it's not much to do. The question is when there is in the middle, there is a critical and there is a medium one. Then you might have to do things which. So, for example, on the I think it's called, I can't remember the exact name. There is a category which is important, and then there is documentation and extra checks you need to do, and that's why. So for the technical things, if your use case fall under these ones, you need to comply with the legislation for the countries. The other thing to know, and this is typical with the European laws, the EU will generate a law, but then it is responsibility of every member country, to implement the laws, which means that the implementation is actually slightly different. This actually happens today, and GDPR, most people think, oh, it's a European law. When you look at the details, it's actually the way the regulator, let's say in the Nordics, would tend to be quite a lot more strict in these areas. the way the regulator interprets GDPR in Norway is actually different the way the regulator in Spain or Italy implemented, meaning some borderline cases are okay in Spain, but are not okay in Nordic under the law. This only apply, by the way, to the borderline cases in things that are very, very, and which is why the law is successful, because the sort of the core cases, pretty much every member is the same, but also when it comes to more sort of borderline edge cases, it is worth seeing where you are working and then look at that particular country, how they're going to implement it. So, for example, Germany will, and they've published how they're going to implement the regulator. France, they're going to do other things. Spain is going to do other things. The UK is going to do other things. And the governments have a few things. So the governments from, so effectively, as I said, the law is one, which is the same for all member countries. But then when it comes to the implementation, it's up to every country responsibility to implement the law. And then the other variable is what regulators do you use? And every country will have different regulators. Every country will have some sort of data organization, which a lot of them were implemented because of GDPR, but the data in the UK is the ICO, Germany will be the data regulator, and France, so on. So I think for the companies will be, you need to familiarize how each country is going to implement it, and then the timelines that they will have it, because there will be differences. And
Yeah,
this
I
will
think
help you.
that's interesting actually, and I'm not an expert on this by any means, but I did read in the text that the specific inclusions they're including, one was the general purpose AI, which was a interesting addition, but the main inclusion in there is that it's any output that is consumed within the EU. So if imagine that we're a company based in the UK or the US or somewhere like that, even if the output of that model is consumed by someone in the EU, then that means that company does fall under this regulation. So how do you think that we can actually satisfy the requirements when potentially there's different like implementations in different countries here?
That is, yeah, absolutely. And that was going to say, it's a good point that the third parties. So if you are operating, I think looking at the focus, if I'm operating in Germany and I use a product which uses AI, even if that product is based in Singapore or US or China, if the output of that product touches citizens in the US, and to your point, and absolutely, that's a good point, because it put pressure on you to validate and to do due diligence on the third parties you use. So I guess you have to do the test. Pretty much, you have to do the test for at least third party. But I think the interesting thing is the party responsible to ensure the AI is actually complying is, this is quite logical, is actually the company that deploy that AI in the Europe countries. Not because, of course, if you create a global product, you don't know how your consumers are gonna, your clients are gonna use your technology. So it's the burden is put on whoever is deploying in the EU. So if I buy a product that is being developed in China, it is my responsibility to ensure that it's compliant. And if it's not, I'm gonna be fined. Not the other. Well, this depends on how I. Then that's the other question for the supply chain. How do I? I'm pretty sure, and I know some people are redoing the supply chain contracts in terms of the liability. So if I'm using a product in China and China doesn't that's something I wasn't aware or whatever, and I'm liable, they should be liable. So that creates another camp. To your question of how do I ensure, the reality is you need to understand which countries you are, and then, but it's a bit like GDPR. Then you go to the minimum common denominator. In my last company, for example, I deploy products, financial banking products across Europe, and some products, the Nordic version was very different from the Spanish version because of the implementation of GDPR. So this and it's not common. You ask any big bank, and they have the same process. Is different. How the attitude, or for example, even like for example with the analogy in data, I think in AI because it's so new, we don't know yet how some countries still haven't quite clarified how they're going to implement it. We haven't seen any cases. I think that it's like GDPR. This, the legislation there, then the regulators, get on more or less. And then as soon as a couple of cases go through the courts, that's when we'll see how this thing works, which is exactly what happened in GDPR. GDPR was launched. Everybody was 4% of my. By the way, the penalties of this law, they are very aligned with GDPR. It was a lot of uncertainty. Companies reacted, and if you look, many companies at the beginning of GDPR were a bit very, very restricted. And then as they see how things develop, they open up a bit. Here is the same principle saying, be careful at the beginning, protect until you see a few cases going through the courts, and then you will see what is they want to do and what is the attitude of regulators, both the European level, but in this kind, the implementation is more country level.
Yeah. Okay. I think that I have spoken to some really big companies in the world that are already tailoring their AI solutions and products, like hyper tailoring their products to specific jurisdictions. The one example that they gave was the fact that in India it is illegal to show a picture of the Indian flag in the wrong orientation. It's got to be the correct orientation. It's technically illegal to do that, and so for some of their products, they had to build models that was effectively capable of understanding that fact and making sure that it didn't output any particular images of the Indian flag the wrong way around. So I can certainly see that there will be different AI products being built for different jurisdictions here as well. Okay, so let's try and start to wrap it up now. Then I think the main thing that our listeners will be interested in is really like how much should I care about this? What should I start thinking about now? Should I start worrying now? And maybe you could talk about what you're thinking about doing at Finestra, because I know you have
Yeah.
AI products that you sell as well. So I mean, what are you personally thinking about at the moment?
So it's all about, and again, to the audience, is make sure you check which, your company, the product they produce, what use case do they fall between this classification, and then check the requirements for this classification. I think the main area, and there are two big things and as I said, it's quite complicated depending on the classification, but there are two areas where people should start thinking about it. One is a bit of the transparency. How do you make decisions based on algorithms, and also when do you need to include what is called a human in the loop or not? Even when the algorithms can do always everything, you might have to do a bit of process analysis. And these banks do this, by the way, today regularly. When you apply for a financial product like a credit card, something like relatively low or a small amount, and algorithms will do a check. And if the case is very, very clear, like say you have an amazing credit score, you have a very good financial story, it's relatively low amount, compared to what you have, the machine will approve it. Or if it's very, really bad, they will decline it automatically. But when things are can be a bit complicated, they refer to a human. I think that's the thinking. People should start thinking about those lines, saying, look, if I'm doing something which is critical, like, and there are, as I said, it's all detailed on the law, like insurance, credit score and insurance, and part of, not all of, but some insurance product and credit score is actually considered critical. So those are, and banks are already, and I know because I was in this industry, they've been getting ready for years on that, and they have to have extra documentation, extra checks. You need to have documented and transparency on the algorithms. And the other big one is on fairness and discrimination. You need to check what the algorithms implications are on the fairness and discrimination. This is a complex area because of two reasons. The first one is fairness is subjective. I mean, this is something which people have sometimes struggled to understand, but it is. It is, believe it or not, every single case you have to have some values. I always put a couple of examples. Um, Culturally, we have different values depending on where we live, and even within Europe, the countries have slightly different values, which will impact you perception of what is fair or not fair. And this actually is a challenge when it comes to magically finish. But just to give you an example of the values, if when you do this experiment, it's called a trolley type of experiment. Imagine a car, a self-driving car, which had a big problem and lost all control. It's doing 100 miles per hour, don't have brakes, and it coming is a road. There is a zebra crossing, and there is on the left a baby, and on the right an elderly person. When you ask a question, say, "Look, this has happened really bad. I cannot brake. Unfortunately, I have to decide. I either run over the baby or run over the sort of elderly people, which likely very bad consequences for them. Which one I do?" When you run this as the values for the different people, if you do this in the West, like in Europe, in the UK, US, most of us will say, well, the baby has all the life ahead, sadly, but the elderly person, is nearly done, whatever, just run over the elderly person. But funny enough, when you run the same thing in the sort of Asian cultures, is the opposite. There is so much respect for the elderly. So I don't know, the elderly has a life, we have to respect it. A new guy hasn't even started, doesn't even know. So this, I'll give you an idea of how massive interpretation. And by the way, self-driving cars, believe it is a ethical bombshell. Even if you want because at some point, and actually there's been some experiments there, you have to configure. People don't want to think about it, but if in a self-driving vehicle, in case of an accident, you might have, for example, another one. This is a bit more subtle and a bit more cynical. If there is an accident and the car cannot avoid it, you can configure as a setting: do I prioritize the life inside the car or outside the car? This is fascinating because it opens. It's a ethical mind, because of course, if it's your car, and again, people will might or might not die, but more on the West, but actually, I will say this globally. If it's your car, you will say, no, of course, inside the car because it's my car. But actually, maybe the equation, if you look at from the society point of view, and outside the car are babies or whatever, how you prioritize, maybe, that is fascinating type of things, which we're going to hit very quickly. And there. So I think, as a summary, check the control and start thinking about the overall process, model transparency, how you capture your data, how you train it. And transparency is a big thing. You should be able to, at any point of time, if somebody asks why the system made that comment, you should be able to have a transparent question. This, by the way, and the last thing I will say about this point is, all these points are not just with AI. Transparency, and you are in the UK. At the moment in the UK, there is a big controversy on a post office case that was a few years ago, which, again, I've seen already some articles. It's quite funny saying it was AI. Well, no, it's not AI, but it was an IT system. It was a software system. It has some bugs. It provided the wrong information. As a result, people went to jail, and some people even commit suicide. Big bug things. There was a cover up. I think the main challenge there is not that the machine made the mistake. It's the whole human surroundings. The point there is, these things, again, are not just a lot of legislation is not just on AI or no AI. Is anytime you automate, anytime there are humans controlling the machines in a system, there is a lot of things which in the past we haven't done, like transparency, looking at the discrimination, how the decisions are impacting different protected groups. That's in the past, has happened, but nobody was looking at. Now, because we're looking, we realize, which means it's an opportunity to improve. But my point is, these things are not just because AI; they've always been existed. And the advice for the audience is, look at your models, transparency, how you get the data. And at some point, can you really explain what you did? The model did what you did. If you can answer that, you will be in a good place. If you cannot or don't want to, you should review your processes.
Okay, that's certainly food for thought. Lovely. Well, that's been really interesting. Thank you so much, Javier. Yeah, if you want to check out Javier's book, then where can we buy it, Javier? Is it on Amazon?
Is everywhere actually in
Everywhere,
Amazon.
everywhere.
Waterstone as well is that's my moment when the first launch. I live in Cambridge. I went to my local Waterstone and it was there, so it was quite.
Amazing! That's great. Did you sort of stand and point in it for a while? And everybody else was like, what's he doing?
It was no, certainly it was something like that. It was even amazing because I was with my daughter and I wasn't expecting to see it. And I thought, oh my god! Right, and then I started talking, and then the guy came here and I said, I'm the author. He actually brought me a sticker and actually I signed the book there. And if you go to Waterstone, you will see that there is signed author. So it was quite amazing.
Oh, that'll be a valuable copy in a few years' time then, if anybody got that.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Javier. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that. If you had any further questions or concerns about the EU AI Act, then please reach out to us via our website at winder.ai. You'll also find lots more interesting articles and videos about the Act where you can learn more. That's it for now. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.